My name is Rachel. I'm 39 years old, and 8 months ago I sat in a lawyer's office and listened to a room full of my own family celebrate the fact that my father had left me absolutely nothing. Not the house I grew up in, not a single dollar from his business, not even his old fishing rod that I'd been holding for him the day he taught me to cast a line when I was 7 years old. My brother smiled through the entire reading. My stepmother reached over and patted my hand like I was a stray cat she felt sorry for, and she said in this soft little voice that everyone in the room could hear, "Well, sweetheart, your father always knew who was worth what." And I want you to remember that sentence, because 7 days later, that exact sentence is what destroyed her. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and if I'm going to tell you this story, you need to understand how we got to that room, because what happened after the funeral only makes sense if you know what happened during the 6 years before it. My father, Raymond, built a commercial roofing company from nothing. He started with one truck, a ladder, and hands that never seemed to stop moving. And by the time I was in high school, that company had crews working in 3 states. He was not a warm man, I'll be honest with you about that. He didn't hug, he didn't say I love you, and he measured people the same way he measured a roof, quietly, carefully, and without telling you what he found. My older brother, Marcus, was the golden one. He was louder, faster, better with people, and when he graduated college with a business degree, everyone assumed he'd take over the company one day. And Marcus assumed it more than anyone. He moved to Chicago, took a corporate job, and started referring to our hometown as that place I'm from at family dinners. But he always made sure to call Dad on his birthday, always sent the expensive gift basket at Christmas, always did the visible things, the things that photograph well, if you know what I mean. I stayed, not because I was noble, I want to be clear about that. I stayed because I loved the town, because my little furniture restoration shop on Main Street paid the bills and let me sleep at night, and because working with my hands was the one thing that ever made me feel like my father's daughter. In my family, that made me the disappointment. My stepmother, Carol, who married my father when I was 17, had a way of asking about my work that always sounded like she was asking about a hobby. "Still sanding your little chairs, Rachel?" That was the tone. More than 20 years of that tone. And Marcus was worse, in his own way, because at every holiday he'd introduce me to whoever he'd brought along as my sister. She's sort of the artistic one. And then he'd smile like he'd just apologized for me. Then 6 years ago, my father had a stroke. And I need you to understand what happened in the 72 hours after that stroke, because it tells you everything about everyone in this story. Marcus flew in, stood in the hospital room for about 40 minutes, took a phone call in the hallway, and flew back to Chicago the next morning because, and this is a direct quote, "Dad wouldn't want us all standing around being dramatic." Carol lasted about 3 weeks as a caregiver before she decided that her back problems, which no doctor had ever documented, made it impossible for her to help him in and out of bed. She moved into the guest wing of the house, which sounds like she was still close by. But in that house, the guest wing might as well have been another zip code. So it became me. I drove to my father's house every single morning before opening the shop, and every evening after I closed it. I learned how to help a proud man through a doorway without taking his dignity along with his balance. I learned his medications, all 11 of them, and the exact order he liked them lined up on the counter, because if the little white one wasn't first, he'd get frustrated. And when a man who built an empire with his hands gets frustrated at a pill bottle he can no longer open, you learn not to make it worse. I learned that he liked the television on, but muted. I learned that at around 4 in the afternoon, his mind was clearest, and that's when he'd talk, really talk, in a way he never had in the 40 years before. He told me about his mother, who cleaned houses so he could finish school. He told me about the winter the company almost went under, and how his crew worked 2 weeks without pay because they believed in him, and how he'd spent the rest of his life quietly making sure every one of those men retired comfortable. My father, it turned out, was a man who did his love in secret and his silence in public, and I only found that out when his body broke enough for the silence to crack. And here's the part I didn't tell anyone at the time. In those afternoon conversations, my father asked questions. Strange, specific questions. He'd ask what Marcus said on their last phone call, and I'd tell him the truth, that Marcus had asked whether the company's books were up to date, and whether Dad had gotten his affairs organized. He'd ask what Carol did all day, and I'd tell him the truth about that too, that she was out most days, and that a jewelry store in the city kept sending little velvet boxes to the house. My father would just nod slowly and look out the window, and sometimes he'd write something in this old green notebook he kept beside his chair. And when I asked him once what he was writing, he closed it, looked at me for a long moment, and said the only thing he ever said about it. He said, "Rachel, a roof tells you where it leaks when the rain comes. People are the same. You just have to wait for rain." I didn't understand that then. I understand it now. My father passed on a Tuesday morning in March, quietly, in his sleep. And I was the one who found him, because of course I was the only one there. And I'm not going to walk you through the grief part. Because if you've lost someone, you already know. And if you haven't, I hope it stays that way for a long time. What I will walk you through is what my family did next, because it happened fast, faster than I thought was possible. Carol had a realtor at the house before the funeral. I am not exaggerating for the story. My father was buried on a Saturday, and on the Thursday before, I pulled into the driveway to pick up his suit for the funeral home, and there was a woman in a blazer photographing the kitchen. Carol didn't even look embarrassed. She said the market was timing sensitive. Marcus flew in the day before the service and spent most of it on his phone. And at the reception afterward, while people were still holding paper plates of food that neighbors had brought, I overheard him in my father's study telling someone that the company would transition smoothly under new leadership, and that he'd already spoken to the operations manager. My father had been in the ground for 4 hours. And then came Monday, the reading of the will at the office of my father's attorney, a quiet, gray-haired man named Mr. Whitfield, who had handled Dad's affairs for 30 years, and who had a habit of looking at people just a half-second longer than was comfortable. Remember Mr. Whitfield. He matters more than anyone realized that day. We all sat down, Marcus in the middle like it was his meeting, Carol beside him, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue, a couple of cousins in the back who showed up out of pure curiosity, and me by the window. Mr. Whitfield opened a folder, and in that flat, careful voice lawyers have, he read my father's will. The house went to Carol. The company, all of it, went to Marcus. Investment accounts, split between the two of them. And then he reached my name, and the room got very quiet, and Mr. Whitfield read, word for word. To my daughter Rachel, I leave nothing further, trusting that she understands why. Trusting that she understands why. 6 years of mornings, 6 years of medications and doctor visits, and catching him when he stumbled, and sitting with him at 4 in the afternoon when the loneliness came in like a tide. And that sentence was what I got. Marcus actually laughed. He tried to cover it with a cough, but I heard it, everyone heard it. And Carol did the hand pat and delivered her line about my father, always knowing who was worth what. And one of the cousins whispered something, and the other one smirked. And I sat there feeling something I don't fully have words for, somewhere between drowning and burning at the same time. But here's the thing. Here's the detail that I didn't process until much later. Lying awake at 2 in the morning, replaying that room over and over. When Mr. Whitfield read that line about me, he didn't look down at the paper the way he had for every other section. He looked directly at me, just for a moment. A half-second longer than was comfortable. And then he moved on. I didn't fight. I want to be honest with you about why. Because it wasn't strength, and it wasn't wisdom. I was just empty. Marcus cornered me by the elevator afterward, and in this generous, princely voice, said that if I ever needed anything within reason, I could always ask. And Carol suggested, before I was even out of the building, that I might want to come collect my little boxes of things from Dad's house by the weekend, because the realtor needed the rooms cleared. My little boxes of things, 6 years, and I was a storage problem. So I went home and I did nothing. I didn't hire a lawyer of my own. I didn't post anything. I didn't demand a single item from that house. I went back to my shop and sanded table legs until my arms ached. Because when your hands know what to do, they can carry you through days your heart can't. And apparently, that decision, the decision to walk away and ask for nothing, was the most important decision of my entire life. I just didn't know it yet. Because on day 7, exactly 7 days after that will was read, my phone rang at 8:40 in the morning, and it was Mr. Whitfield's office, and his assistant said, and I remember every word of this, Mr. Whitfield needs to see you today, alone, and he asked me to tell you not to mention this appointment to anyone. He said you'd understand once you're here. And when I walked into that office an hour later, Mr. Whitfield was sitting behind his desk with 2 things in front of him. A sealed envelope with my father's handwriting on it, and a second folder, thicker than the first one, with a single word written across the top in my father's blocky capital letters. The word was rain, and Mr. Whitfield looked at me, and for the first time in 30 years of knowing that man, I saw him almost smile, and he said, Rachel, please sit down. The will you heard last week was real, and it was legal, but it was never your father's final will. It was his test. And for the past 7 days, my office has been documenting exactly how every member of your family responded to it. He slid the envelope across the desk and he said, "Before I show you what's in the folder, your father wanted you to read this first." In his words, not mine. My hands were shaking when I opened it. The letter was written on the yellow legal paper my father always used, in that heavy slanted handwriting that pressed so hard into the page you could feel the words on the back of it with your fingertips. And it started with two words I had never once heard him say out loud in 39 years. It started with, "Rachel, I'm sorry." He wrote, "If you're reading this, then it's been 7 days and you didn't fight." I told Whitfield that if you contested the will, if you hired a lawyer, if you demanded a single dollar, he was to leave this envelope sealed forever and let the first will stand exactly as it was read. So the fact that you're holding this letter tells me the last thing I needed to know about you. You lost everything publicly in front of people who laughed at you, and you walked away with your dignity instead of your anger. That was the final test, sweetheart. And I'm sorry it had to be you who took it, because you were the only one I already trusted. But a man who spent 50 years checking his own work doesn't stop just because his hands stopped working. He wrote, "You used to ask me what I was writing in the green notebook. I was writing down the rain every time Marcus called and asked about the books instead of asking about my pain. Every velvet box that arrived at the house for Carol while I was learning to walk again down the hallway. Every morning you showed up before the sun and never once asked me what was in the will. Did you notice that, Rachel? 6 years. You never asked. They never stopped asking." Marcus brought it up on 11 separate phone calls. I counted. Carol brought paperwork to my bedside twice while I was on strong medication, hoping I'd sign without reading. I read. I always read. I built that company reading contracts other men skimmed, and being underestimated turned out to be the most profitable thing that ever happened to me. And you, my girl, you've been underestimated at every dinner table in this family for 20 years. So I suspect you know something about that too. And then came the part I had to stop and set down on the desk because my eyes wouldn't stay clear enough to read it. He wrote, "I know I never said it. My father never said it to me." And I told myself that providing was the same as saying it. And I was wrong, and I ran out of time to fix it face to face. So I'm going to say it now, the only way a stubborn old roofer knows how, which is in writing, witnessed, and notarized, so that it's legally binding. I love you, Rachel. I have loved you since the day you were born, and I have been proud of you every single day since, including the days I acted like I wasn't. It's on the record now. No one can contest it. I sat in that leather chair and I cried the way I hadn't cried at the funeral, the way I hadn't let myself cry in 6 years of holding everything together for a man who couldn't hold himself up. And Mr. Whitfield, to his eternal credit, simply stood, walked to the window, and studied the parking lot for as long as I needed him to. And when I finally set the letter down, he came back, sat across from me, opened the folder marked Rain, and said, "Now, let me explain what your father actually did, because it is, frankly, the most thorough thing I have witnessed in 34 years of practicing law. Here's what my father did. 2 years before he died, when his mind was still sharp and 2 doctors certified in writing that it was, he executed not 1 will, but 2. The first will, the one read in that office with everyone smiling, was completely real and completely legal on the day it was signed. But here's what nobody in that room knew. Under the law, when a person leaves more than one will, the most recent one is the only one that counts. And my father had signed a second will 1 week after the first, which meant the first one was overridden before the ink on it was even fully dry. It was never going to distribute a single dollar. It existed for one purpose only: to be read out loud to a room full of people who thought the game was over, so that everyone would show their true face while they believed no one was keeping score. My father's instructions to Whitfield were precise. Read the first will, say nothing, wait 7 days, watch the rain. And Whitfield had watched, because here's the detail Marcus and Carol never bothered to learn. The detail anyone would know if they'd spent 5 minutes asking questions instead of celebrating. An estate doesn't transfer the moment a will is read. There's a legal process, and it takes months, and until a court finishes it, nobody owns anything. The house wasn't Carol's yet, the company wasn't Marcus's yet. Every single thing they did in those 7 days, they did to property that did not legally belong to them. And they did a lot. Whitfield turned the folder around so I could see it, page by page. And honestly, part of me wanted to look away, because there is something deeply sad about watching people you've known your whole life fail a test they didn't know they were taking. Day 1, the day after the reading, Marcus walked into my father's company, called a meeting he had no authority to call, and announced himself as the new owner. Day 2, he fired the operations manager, a man named Gary who had been with my father for 22 years, who had driven my father to the hospital the day of his first dizzy spell, because Gary asked to see the court paperwork before handing over the accounts. That one question saved the company, and it cost Gary his job, and Marcus told him in front of the whole office that loyalty to a dead man wasn't a skill. There were 4 written statements from employees who heard him say it. Day 3, Marcus met with a competitor, and there was a term sheet in the folder, because he wasn't planning to run my father's company at all. He was planning to sell it, break it into pieces, let the crews go, and take the money back to Chicago. 230 people's jobs, and he'd priced them out before the headstone was even carved. Carol's pages were shorter, but somehow worse. Day 2, she sold my father's watch, the 1971 gold watch his own crew had bought him. The winter the company survived, the one thing in that house that was pure memory and no market value beyond the metal. She sold it to a dealer for a fraction of what it meant, and Whitfield's investigator had bought it back the same afternoon, and it was sitting in the folder in a small gray box. And I'm not ashamed to tell you, my hands shook when I held it. Day 4, she listed the house. Day 5, and this is the one that made my chest go cold. She called a donation service to clear out what she called the medical room, which was my father's bedroom and everything in it: his chair, his green notebook, the photographs of his parents, was scheduled for pickup that Friday, like it was junk after a garage sale. Whitfield had quietly canceled the pickup. The notebook was in the folder too. And then Whitfield laid the second will, the real will, on the desk between us, and he read me the clause my father had written into it. and I'm going to give it to you the way my father wrote it, because no lawyer on earth writes like this. It said, "Everything I built goes to the one who asked for nothing. If more than one of them asks for nothing, divide it among them equally, and consider me a lucky man. If none of them ask for nothing, sell it all and give it to the trade school in town, because I'd rather fund strangers with rough hands than family with smooth ones." One heir had asked for nothing. One heir had spent 7 days asking for nothing, while the others carved up a table that wasn't theirs. The house, the company, the accounts, all of it was mine. And the will had one final instruction attached, one last piece of my father's stagecraft. Everyone who attended the first reading was to be summoned back to the same room at the same hour, told only that there was a procedural matter regarding the estate. My father wanted the second reading held in the same chairs, so the following Monday at 10 in the morning we all filed back into that conference room, and I want you to picture it because I have replayed it 1,000 times, and it has never once gotten old. Marcus came in checking his watch, annoyed, telling Whitfield he had a flight at 2, and asking if this could be handled by email next time. Carol came in wearing a new coat, and I recognized the shade of the shopping bag she'd left in her car because it was from the jewelry store with the velvet boxes. The cousins came back too, because curiosity is a renewable resource. And I sat in the same chair by the window, and I said good morning to everyone, and nobody said it back. And that was fine, because I knew something they didn't. And let me tell you, after a lifetime of being the one who was laughed at, sitting quietly inside that knowledge for 4 more minutes was its own kind of peace. Mr. Whitfield closed the door. He sat down. He folded his hands on top of a folder that nobody paid attention to, and he said, "Thank you all for coming." Before the estate proceeds to probate, the law requires that the decedent's most recent valid will be the one submitted to the court. And Marcus said, "Right, the will, we did this already." And Whitfield looked at him, that half-second too long, and said the sentence that split my family's life into a before and an after. He said, "No, Mr. Marcus, we read a will. We did not read the most recent one. Your father executed a second will, dated 1 week after the first. Under the law, only the second will stands. I'll be reading it now." I have heard silence before. I have never heard silence like that. Carol's tissue stopped halfway to her face and just hung there. Marcus laughed, that same little laugh from the first reading, except this time it came out wrong, thin, like air leaking from something, and he said, that's not legal. You can't just, we already." And Whitfield slid a certified copy across the table and said, "You're welcome to have any attorney in the state review it. 2 physicians certified your father's capacity in writing. It was witnessed and notarized. It is, if I may say so, the cleanest document I have ever filed." And then he read it, the whole thing, including the clause, "Everything I built goes to the one who asked for nothing." And the room froze. Carol turned to look at me, and I watched it happen in her face, in real time, the exact moment she rewound the last 7 days, and saw every single thing she'd done, and understood that someone had been watching. Her voice came out in a whisper, and she said, "You knew. You sat there last week, and you knew." And I said quietly, because I'd promised myself I would not raise my voice in that room. No, Carol. Last week I knew exactly what you told me, that my father always knew who was worth what. And I let her own sentence sit on the table between us. She looked at it. Everybody looked at it. Nobody picked it up. Marcus went the other direction. Marcus got loud. He talked about lawyers. He talked about lawsuits. He talked about undue influence. He said I had manipulated a sick old man. And I'll admit that one stung, right up until Mr. Whitfield opened the folder marked Rain and began reading, in that flat legal voice, a summary of the last 7 days. The unauthorized meeting, Gary. The witness statements, the term sheet with the competitor, with Marcus's signature on the cover page, dated 3 days after the funeral. The realtor, the watch, and the name of the dealer and the receipt. The donation pickup scheduled for the medical room. And with every page, Marcus got smaller in his chair. And by the end, he wasn't threatening lawsuits anymore. He was doing math. Because Whitfield explained, gently, the way you'd explain weather to a child, that disposing of estate property before probate isn't just rude, it creates personal liability, and that whether the estate pursued any of it was now entirely at the discretion of the sole heir. And then everyone in the room turned and looked at me. Here's what I did, and I want to be honest, because I thought about it for a long time before that meeting. And my father's letter was in my purse while I decided. I didn't sue anybody. I told Carol she had 60 days to find a new place, more than the law required, and that the coat and the velvet boxes were hers to keep, because I wanted nothing that had been bought during those 7 days, not even the satisfaction. I told Marcus I wouldn't pursue the liability on one condition, that he sign a release, walking away from the estate cleanly and permanently, and he signed it before his 2 o'clock flight, which I think tells you everything my father already knew about him. And then I drove to Gary's house, and I sat at his kitchen table, and I asked him to come back and run operations for the company, except this time with a share of ownership in his name. Because my father wrote in that green notebook, in an entry from 2 years ago, that I've now read 100 times. If it ever comes to it, Gary stays. Men like Gary are the roof. The company is still running, all 230 jobs plus 12 new ones. I still open my little shop on Main Street 3 days a week. Because sanding a table by hand is still the closest thing I know to a conversation with my dad. His watch is in a glass case in the company's front office, next to a photo of the original crew, and under it there's a small brass plate with the only inscription that felt right. It says he always read the contract. And the green notebook sits on my nightstand. And some nights, when the house is quiet, I open it to a random page and read whatever he wrote there. And it's strange, because a notebook full of other people's failures somehow became the most loving thing my father ever gave me, second only to that letter. Because every entry about Marcus, every entry about Carol, ends the same way, with one short line at the bottom of the page, and it took me weeks to notice the pattern. After every disappointment he recorded, he wrote 3 words. But Rachel came. That's it. That was his accounting. On the worst days of his life, when the phone calls were about money and the velvet boxes kept arriving, he balanced the books the only way he knew how. But Rachel came. Carol moved out in 40 days, not 60, and I heard through one of the cousins that she tells people the will was a legal technicality and that she chose to walk away. And honestly, she can have that version because I've learned that people who need a story to survive will write one, and it costs me nothing to let her keep it. Marcus called me exactly once, about 4 months later, and I braced myself for anger, but he was quiet, and after a long pause, he asked me a question I never expected. He asked, "Did Dad ever say anything about me in the notebook?" And I could have hurt him then, really hurt him, with 11 phone calls and a term sheet, and a sentence about loyalty not being a skill. But I thought about my father, who tested people but never humiliated them, who let the rain do the talking, and I said, he wrote that you were the best salesman he ever met, and that he hoped one day you'd figure out what was worth selling and what wasn't. That was true. It's on page 53. Marcus was quiet for a while, and then he said, "Thank you," and honestly, that's the most honest conversation my brother and I have ever had. We're not close. I don't know if we ever will be. But the door isn't nailed shut, and I think my father would have wanted it that way, because the test was never about revenge. It was about finding out who was safe to leave things with, including, I think, whatever was left of our family. Last month, on what would have been my father's 74th birthday, I drove out to the cemetery with 2 cups of coffee, the way I used to bring them to his room, one for him that he'd barely touch, and one for me. And I set his cup on the headstone, and I told him about the company, about Gary's daughter joining the office, about the new crew we hired in the spring. And before I left, I told him the thing I'd been carrying since that day in Whitfield's office. I said, "You know, Dad, you didn't have to test me. I would have shown up anyway, even for nothing, especially for nothing." And I stood there in the wind for a minute, and I swear I could almost hear him answer, in that dry, gravelly voice, "I know, Rachel. That's why it all went to you. A man doesn't leave his roof to someone who only shows up when the sun is out." So that's my story. My family read a will and showed me exactly who they were, and my father, from beyond everything, showed me who he had always been, a man who couldn't say, "I love you" out loud. So he built a machine out of paper and patience that would say it for him in writing, witnessed, and notarized, so that no one could ever contest it. And if you take one thing from this, let it be what he taught me without ever raising his voice. People will tell you who they are when they think no one is keeping score. Believe them. And if there's someone in your life who shows up before the sun, who asks about your pain instead of your paperwork, hold on to that person, because roofs are checked in the rain, and so are hearts. Thank you for listening to my story all the way to the end. It truly means more than you know. If it touched something in you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And answer me this, because I read every single comment. Do you think my father's test was fair, or should he have simply told the truth from the beginning? I genuinely want to know what you would have done in his place. And if you believe that quiet loyalty deserves to be seen, subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are more stories like mine waiting to be told. Stories about the moment when the people who underestimated you go completely silent. Take care of yourselves, take care of the ones who show up, and I'll see you in the next story.